Right, hello everybody. Great to see your faces. I just like to see you file in, and I'm going to put it on speaker view now. I want to welcome Catherine Grace Katz, the author of this wonderful book, The Daughters of Yalta. And I think many of you, it looks like from our email invitation that many of you have already started reading the book. So I'll be interested. So if you have, chat that you have and, type that you have in the chat, and certainly ask any questions, because I have so many questions for Catherine, but I don't want to get in the way. So Catherine, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. This is so much fun. And thank you to all of you for joining us.
I can't hear you. Are you?
Can you hear me?
Yes,
hello?
Now I can hear you.
Great, fantastic. Thank you everyone for joining us. This is so much fun to see all of you. And thank you very much for your interest in the book.
Oh gosh. Well, I think there are a lot of people that were drawn to the Splendid and Averell for many reasons. And I think this is such a wonderful continuation, kind of next chapter to see. And so much has changed. Yes. For each of them. So it's really amazing to see, but I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. So we're hearing that people have, finishing the book today, says Beth, and Carol says she's read about a third of the way. So first of all, tell us a little bit about yourself, because I just want people to understand that you're a young historian, a young female historian, which I think is like super rare, right? But you're also studying law. So tell us about your education, because it's really
So I have always loved history since I was little. I mean, my favorite movies growing up were White Christmas and The Sound of Music and The Great Escape, and a lot of these wonderful stories from World War II, which I just always loved. And I think something might happen to the screen.
Oops.
I just lost it.
If someone is screen sharing, it looks like somebody's screen sharing. Can you stop screen sharing? I had it for Catherine.
My screen disappeared. Oh, there we go.
Okay, sorry about that.
That's okay. So I always grew up loving World War II and history, and my grandfather was in the Navy during World War II, and I have very fond memories of chasing him around at Thanksgiving with a legal pad and asking him to tell me his stories about that experience.
What branch of the military?
I'm sorry?
What branch of the military?
He was in the Navy.
Okay.
Yes, so great stories, my grandparents, and so this is an era that I always found fascinating. I loved the style and the music and of course, all the elements of the war, and just the idea that the war touched everyone's lives, but regular people were able to ask more of themselves and give more of themselves than they realized perhaps they had within them. And I always found this really inspiring, despite the fact that it was a horrible period in history. And so I pretty much always knew that I wanted to study history. I was a history major at Harvard, and then I also had a graduate degree in history from Cambridge in England. I had wanted to study in England since I was about 5 years old, so it was a great opportunity to do that right after school. And while I was in school writing my thesis and graduate dissertation, I was once again drawn back to some of these characters in this era that I loved as a child. And somewhat accidentally, serendipitously, ended up studying Churchill in a larger degree than I had anticipated, but started out learning about him actually as a young man during the Boer War, when he made a daring escape from a Boer POW camp, which really rocketed him to fame and launched his political career. And then as a graduate student, once again, serendipitously, Churchill became a large figure in my dissertation. I had not realized how involved he was in the subject, which was the origins of modern counterintelligence practices. He was Home Secretary in Britain during World War I. And so I spent a lot of time learning about Churchill, however, not during the Second World War, which is a bit unusual, even though I had done a lot of reading about this on my own. And after graduating, I decided I should do what I thought was the sensible thing to do. Like many recent graduates, I decided to give finance a try. And so I moved back to New York, and coincidentally, in the lobby of my office, there was a bookstore called Chartwell Booksellers.
Yes, I had, I've lived in New York for like 20 years and is it new? I had no idea that they were there.
It's not, it's a small one tucked away in the lobby of this office, which looks like any other office, but this bookstore, which is named after Winston Churchill's country home, they're the only Winston Churchill bookstore in the world, and they specialize in first editions of Winston Churchill's works, but also books about the life and times of Churchill, including many new books. So on days when I'd go down to get a coffee, or I'd say I was going to get a coffee, I really just needed to re-engage with history, I'd go down to the bookstore, talk to the owner, and I got to know him. And soon after, he introduced me to the International Churchill Society.
Here, I'm showing a picture of the...
Yes, that's it. Yeah. That's the store. It's a wonderful store.
The only Winston Churchill bookshop in the world, including in England.
Yes, including in England.
Stunning. Okay.
But it's right in New York, which is great fun. So if you're ever in Manhattan, I suggest you check it out, especially after the pandemic is over. It's a wonderful place. And in the afternoons, they have a gentleman in the lobby who plays great jazz music on the piano, which is also lovely. Perfect ambiance for it. Yes, so it was just kind of this confluence of serendipitous events that I was working in finance, but history kind of seemed to be pulling me back in.
Oh, you were talking about the bookstore. Sorry, I interrupted you. Tell us what happened with the bookstore that led you to, that inspired you to write the book.
Yeah. So after so many visits to this bookstore, I think the owner was a bit surprised to see a young woman who was so interested in this period in history. This is before the show The Crown had come out, and I think that has also reawakened people's interest in this period, perhaps who may not have been as excited about it as I was. And so he offered to introduce me to the International Churchill Society, which was having a dinner with Madeleine Albright right across the street from my office one evening. And there I met not only people who, professors, other professionals who wanted to encourage the study of history and encourage young people to go into public service, but also members of the Churchill family. And it was around that time that they were opening Winston's middle daughter, Sarah's, papers to outside researchers for the first time.
Okay. So for those that have read the Splendid and the Bile, Erik Larson had access to Mary's diaries. So Sarah is the older daughter, right? Yes.
Yes, she was the middle of the Churchill's children.
We'll meet her because once you've explained to us like how you came to the book, then I'll show them your great cards so they could see photos of the women, of the daughters. So
fantastic. Yes, but it was kind of coincidental that my first introduction to this was through Sarah, and that family was opening these papers, because I had grown up going to the cloister at Sea Island in Georgia every summer with my family. And on the wall in the lobby, there's a beautiful picture of Sarah Churchill on her wedding day in 1949. Oh. And she had eloped there with her second husband, and I walked past this picture all the time. And so to me, it felt so almost like fate that here I was, having had this kind of passing experience with Sarah Churchill for my whole life, and now had the opportunity to see her life from a perspective that no one had before.
And they wanted an article written about Churchill and his daughter, is that right? In celebration of the papers being released, is that right?
Exactly, yes. They wanted an article about her archive and her papers, exploring her life through these letters and correspondence and scrapbooks that had just been opened for the first time. Okay,
so what led you to hone in on Yalta and these 2 weeks?
So initially I thought I was going to write the book, it was going to be a biography of Sarah Churchill, but the more I came to read her letters, I grew more and more fascinated with her experience during the war. I think if anyone knows Sarah Churchill, it's in the context of her having been an actress. Mm-hmm. She was in a movie opposite Fred Astaire called Royal Wedding in 1959, which is a really fun film. And so people know her in this context if they know her at all today, but she had a remarkable experience during World War II as an officer in the women's branch of the Royal Air Force, serving as an aerial reconnaissance intelligence officer. So she would look at photographs that had been taken from thousands of feet in the sky and determine useful pieces of information to help guide Allied operations.
Extremely detailed work. I mean, seeing which way the grass was pressed to see whether it was, troop movements or whether it was cows grazing. I mean, it was down to that level. She was really incredible. Yeah.
Yes. So it was, I became more fascinated with her work during the war, but especially with her opportunities to travel with her father as his chosen aide to first the Tehran conference in 1943, and then to the Yalta Conference in 1945. And despite the fact that I had studied Yalta and Tehran and this period numerous times, I had no idea that Sarah had been at these conferences, nor that FDR and Ambassador Averell Harriman had been inspired to bring their daughters to Yalta, having seen how valuable Sarah was to her father at Tehran. So you have these three women who were integral parts of this conference. And even though I was a history student and had spent a lot of time engaging with this material, I just had no idea that they were there. And very few people do.
Yes, it's true. Which leads me to ask, I'll just ask it just because it's coming up now. Do you think, because I wrote this, the Instagram post that I wrote, it's, reminded me of Hamilton saying that we're back in there, the narrative, and that history depends upon who tells the story. So yes. Do you think the fact that you're a female historian has anything to do with the fact that you've focused on the daughters, or on the untold parts of, that you put them back in the narrative is what I'm saying.
Well, I'm a huge Hamilton fan. I don't think a week goes by that I don't listen to the soundtrack. It's my go-to running music. It's, anytime you have a task that you don't want to do, put on Hamilton. So I very much appreciate the reference. I think it's kind of a twofold issue. I think part of the reason that we didn't know so much about them is because the sources that were important to tell their story with this level of detail weren't available until recently.
Okay.
Sarah's papers had not been opened. Kathleen Harriman had died in 2011, and it was only then that her sons discovered a box of her papers, her letters to her sister from her time with her father in London and Moscow during the war. And she had never really talked about the war with her family, very much like members of her generation, was very humble, didn't think what she'd done was any more important than anyone else.
Wow.
And then I also had the opportunity to speak with Anna Roosevelt's children who are still alive. Her daughter was a teenager during Yalta and remembers this whole period very clearly. So I think partly it's the sources. Okay. I think another part of it is in these geopolitical histories of Yalta, the Yalta Conference itself is so incredibly dense. So if you are writing a very scholarly work about the day-to-day conferences, it's not just the conferences of the big three, it's also the foreign ministers' meetings and the military meetings. And so on a rare occasion, one of the daughters would mention kind of as a lighter aside to add a bit of color in the midst of very dense work, but not to the extent that gives them a real sense of personality and character within the narrative. But I do think that it's not just being a female historian, but the fact that I was the same age as these women were at Yalta. I started writing this book when I was just a little bit younger than Kathy Harriman. She was 27 at Yalta. I'm now, 29, just slightly younger than Sarah Churchill was at Yalta. And so I think it's, yes, being a woman, but also trying to put myself in their shoes and imagining what would it like to be this age and to be asked to get up and give a toast in front of Stalin and Vyacheslav Molotov and Levin Beria and some of those fearsome people in history in Russian, at the age I am today.
Right. Wow. Yeah, I'd like you to set the stage for people to give them a sense of like exactly what, for example, Kathleen Harriman had to deal with when she walked into the palace, which I'll send everybody a file of the palace, which is behind me, so they can use it as their own Zoom background if they select this book for their book club, then it's a really great background.
Fantastic.
And then also, I just want to mention that there is a Gentleman in Moscow tie-in because of the Metropole Hotel.
Yes.
Right?
Exactly.
So yeah, let's explain about the Metropole Hotel and then tell them what Kathleen walked into. And
yes.
Yeah.
So I think, like many of you, A Gentleman in Moscow is one of my favorite books that I've read in recent years. I read it again at the beginning of the pandemic. To me, it's become an old friend, and I just love it. And I had the very good fortune to meet Amor Towles recently, which was such a great experience and really, something that I'll never forget. He's a phenomenal writer. But the Hotel Metropole, which is, of course, the setting for A Gentleman in Moscow, features in the book because just before Yalta, the Soviets, it was really kind of a last minute preparation to put this conference together. They hadn't decided where they were going to hold the meeting. Stalin didn't want to come any farther west than the Soviet Union. Churchill and FDR finally agree to meet him, but the choices that they have to meet him at every location, it's dangerous to get there. It's extremely far away, it's thousands of miles away. And the whole area has really been ransacked and ravaged by the fighting of the last few years of the war. And so Lavaria Palace, where they're meeting, is a place that was once beautiful. It was the summer palace of Tsar Nicholas II and his family before the Russian Revolution. But there's nothing left. It was a gorgeous palace, but the Nazis have stripped everything that the Soviets hadn't already taken out of it already. There's no furniture, there are no lamps, there is, even down to the doorknobs. It's been
the Nazis took everything. Yeah.
And so the Soviets have to restock the palace to make it fit for this incredibly important conference. And so what they do is they take the contents of the Hotel Metropole and the Hotel National and several other glamorous locations in Moscow, and they put everything on trains and heave it 1,000 miles south to the Crimea to appoint this palace with everything that you need, not just the glamorous and the beautiful, art and decoration and silver and china, but ashtrays and hangers and mattresses.
Yeah, I'm just showing a picture of the hotel. Yeah.
So you can imagine some of the beautiful pieces surrounding the Count and a Gentleman in Moscow that are now in Lavaria Palace, where the American delegation is staying.
So she had to come in, and she had to set up lodgings for. There were something like 9 bathrooms, but how many people were coming? I mean, it was
hundreds of people coming. Everyone, the most important military leaders, government leaders, across the 3 delegations, the Americans, British, and Soviets. It's only the Americans that are staying in Lavaria Palace because there's so many of them that they need 2 more villas to house everyone. And they decide that Roosevelt should stay at Lavaria Palace because he is in a wheelchair, and to make it easier for him to attend the conference sessions every day, he should stay where the conference is being held. But Kathleen Harriman and her father, Averell, who is the ambassador to the Soviet Union, arrive early to ensure that the preparations that the Soviets are undertaking are up to their standards, that the palace has been thoroughly deloused. They have to come in with DDT and get rid of the bed bugs.
There are bed bugs. There's
bed bugs everywhere. Kathleen has to coordinate with all the different teams that the Soviets have put together, the military, local people, conscripted laborers. And when she moved to Moscow in 1943 with her father, she decided that she was going to learn Russian for both of them because he wouldn't have time. So she speaks Russian to the extent that she can communicate with the Russians, the Soviet officers who are leading this effort to make everything fit for the conference. And so she has quite a Herculean task on her hand, and the Soviets have a mere 3 weeks to put everything in order. And you think about the summits and the international meetings that happen today between world leaders, and to think that anyone would dare to hold this type of conference in that setting with that lack of preparation is just astounding to think, even just from a security perspective, that would never be allowed today. So it really just goes to show how important it was to have this meeting, but also, the real grit that the Allied leaders, especially Churchill and Roosevelt, had to get to this conference where it's extremely dangerous to even get there.
Well, they chose Yalta. Yalta is it's called the Crimea because it's the Crimean Peninsula, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
As opposed to Ukraine, which is not the Ukraine, it's kind of the opposite. So it's called the Crimea. So at any rate, they chose Yalta because Stalin was basically making them come to him, right? Yes. He was claiming it was a health issue. So this is kind of their way of going as far as possible without entering Russian territory.
Yes, Stalin says that his doctors have advised him not to travel, to not fly. In reality, Stalin's afraid of flying. And he's also afraid of leaving his security apparatus around him in the Soviet Union. And unfortunately for Churchill and Roosevelt, at this point in the war, they need Stalin a lot more than he needs them. The Soviets have boots on the ground across Eastern Europe. The Red Army is firmly in control. The race is on to liberate Berlin, and it looks like the Soviets will get there first. And so if Churchill and Roosevelt want to meet with him, Stalin now holds the upper hand, which he did not have a year and a half earlier when they met for the first time in 1943. It just really goes to show how much the situation has changed at this point in the war. And for those of you who read The Splendid and the Vile, At that point, the Soviets had not even entered the war on the side of the Allies. And so a lot can change in just 5 years.
Yeah, the balance of power, and to understand that if you had to, that England was really had the least, power, essentially. I mean, they were, yeah, so it was, yeah.
Yes. One of my professors, I always remember from college, she talked about how the British Empire mortgaged the empire to pay for the war, to afford to continue to fight when they were fighting alone. And so at this point, Churchill is trying as hard as he can. He desperately does not want to be the prime minister responsible for the dismantling of the British Empire, but even just to stay alive and to save as many people as possible. This is the reality, and the Americans and the Soviets have a much stronger position at this point.
Yeah. So it is very unusual to have these 3 daughters, to have these leaders bring their 3 daughters. So what was the common theme that inspired these 3 to bring their daughters to Yalta?
Yes. So it's incredibly forward thinking in a sense that these men who you don't think about them as parents necessarily, but to some people they really were just dad. And for them to choose their daughters as their aides, each of the daughters had unique skills and experiences that made them very useful as members of the delegation. But the common thread among the 3 of them is that they're able to occupy this quasi-official realm where they are there as members of the delegation, but they're not in a position where they're necessarily speaking for their government. And so because they carry the force of what their fathers want to say and the messages they wanted to deliver, but not in an official way that will commit their government to any particular plan of action, they can kind of move back and forth and deliver subtle, nuanced messages or gather information for their fathers that someone who's acting in an official capacity cannot.
Plausible deniability, essentially,
yes,
right?
Exactly.
Right. And so, so there are several things that, secrets that are being kept by each of these daughters, right?
Absolutely.
Want to mention that?
Yeah, so for some of them, it's a more open secret. For example, Kathleen Harriman is keeping the secret of her father Averell's affair with Churchill's daughter-in-law, Pamela Churchill, a secret. Pamela is married to Winston's son, Randolph. And when the Harrimans lived in London, while Averell was the Lend-Lease envoy early in the war, Pamela and Averell developed a romance, and Kathleen was at the time very good friends with Pamela. They're about the same age. In fact, Pamela is just 2 years younger than Kathleen. And so it's kind of an open secret. Everybody sort of knows about the affair between Pamela and Averell, but Pamela's also having affairs with other people, including 2 other members of the delegation who are there, one British, one American. And so there's
I'm just sharing a quote that she had. This is a picture of her that I found that explains, you describe her sensuality and her great love affairs. And so this quote sums it all.
Yes, she was a woman who, she had a certain way of looking at life, and I don't know it's one that everyone would agree with, but she was determined to be in the thick of things, and she really looked up to an ancestor of hers named Jane Digby, who was a great courtesan, and she saw this as a way to accumulate a lot of power and become an incredibly important person, which she did. And unfortunately, it was at the expense of certain people's marriages. So that is one of the main secrets that is being kept. Another secret that's being kept is one that Anna Roosevelt is keeping for her father, and that's the fact that her father is incredibly poor health. He is dying of congestive heart failure at the time. And other than the doctor, only Anna knows just how desperate the situation has become. Even FDR himself doesn't ask questions of the doctor. He doesn't know that he has congestive heart failure. And unfortunately, there's really no cure for it at the time. And so all that they can do is manage his condition as well as they can. And for Anna, that is trying to keep as many people out of his room as possible. Everyone's clamoring for an audience with him. She's trying to decide who really does need to meet with him, who could meet with somebody else. And so it's this very difficult position that she finds herself in, trying to balance so many interests without being able to say why she's trying to keep certain people at bay, including Churchill, who desperately wants to meet with FDR to create a united front before their meetings with Stalin, but she knows how much.
Understand why he's being kind of given the brush off. I mean, and it's such an important time for them to present a united front, but he doesn't know, the reason why, and it comes at a kind of a price, I'd say.
Yeah.
But just to return to this, so Anna was the one that apparently at the time of FDR's congestive heart failure, Anna was the one that insisted on having a cardiologist look at her father and not the White House doctor, right?
Correct. She moved back into the White House around Christmas 1943, and so she realizes that there's something very different about her father. He's not as sharp as he used to be. He nods off. He seems distracted, losing focus, and she's very concerned. And so she raises her concerns with his doctor. He kind of brushes her off, and she says, "No, I know something's wrong." And so she does insist on a comprehensive medical exam. And a young cardiologist named Howard Brune is the one who completes this exam, and he realizes just how sick FDR is. But FDR doesn't want to know anything about his condition. And Eleanor Roosevelt is similarly somewhat in denial that things have changed, and she doesn't want to know either. So poor Anna, unfortunately, has to bear this very difficult burden. Not only, it's knowing that your father is about to die, but your father is also the leader of the United States of America, and she's trying to do what she thinks is best for him and for the country. And sometimes that puts her in a difficult position to have to make some choices that are really not fair for her to be making.
Yeah, there are echoes of what's going on right now. I'd say, he's certainly not the first president to not have full disclosure about what's going on. But Sarah Churchill took one look at FDR and knew, right, something was going on when she saw FDR. Yeah.
She had met him at the Tehran conference in 1943, and she remembers this very jovial, lively person. And just within moments of meeting him again at the rendezvous point in Malta on their way to Yalta, she knows something has changed. She can tell the relationship between her father and FDR is different. And she asks herself and writes in a letter to her mother, is he sick or has he moved away from us? And so Sarah is a very perceptive individual, and one that is of great value to her father, to really be able to perceive the situation with a bit of distance and a bit of less emotion than her father, who is very hurt that FDR has put some distance between them.
Yes. Yeah. It's harrowing to see because the cost is so high. I mean, they just really needed to be of one mind. So at any rate, so Sue is asking, were there any big surprises for Catherine in your research, or how you felt while writing the book?
The process of researching this was kind of like, turn one page and then find another and another, rather than kind of diving into one huge box of information all at once. It was really kind of a chain, and continually finding links in the chain, often in surprising ways. I think overall the most surprising thing was just the level of interconnectedness of all of these families, not just the three families at the heart of the story, but also, for example, Harry Hopkins, who brought his son to Yalta as the official photographer for the Americans. He was an army photographer, and some of the iconic pictures that we know of Yalta today were taken by a very young Robert Hopkins, who was also friendly with the daughters. And then Lavaria Palace, who is the head of the NKVD and the secret police for Stalin. His son is also there, though nobody knows he's there because he's part of the secret listening, the bugging operation, who bugs in the rooms of the British and American leaders. He's listening in on the conversations that they're having. And so wow. I didn't realize before starting the research just how kind of multi-generational the story was, and how closely the families were all tied together. And perhaps it's not surprising, because I think even especially if you're the president or the prime minister, you're faced with incredibly difficult, gut-wrenching decisions to make, and you need someone to mull over these issues that you are not sure if your conscience is telling you the right thing. You need someone that you can trust implicitly, and oftentimes that person, those people are your family, and so perhaps politics and family and the personal side of things aren't quite as removed as we think, and right. Yalta is really one of those moments where the personal and the political collide.
Yeah, it's a really powerful example of it. And so how would you say that each daughter contributed to and influenced their father's mission?
Yes.
Yalta?
So Sarah Churchill, as I mentioned, was in the women's branch of the Royal Air Force. So she has a very keen grasp of the actual military side of operations and the importance of certain issues from a very technical perspective. And at times she even knows some of these operations better than her father does, to his great amusement and pride, which is really very sweet.
There's a very funny story in the book, yeah.
But she also has, since she was a little girl, she felt like she had this deep connection with her father and understood him in a way that other people didn't. And probably this is true. And I think that other than her mother Clementine, Sarah really did understand the mind of Winston Churchill better than anyone. And so she is there to be a conscience for him in a way, and to be the person that he can talk to late at night when he is weighed down by the cares of the world, to express his emotions kind of in the heat of the moment, but collect his thoughts to be able to present them in the best way once he does go into the conference room the next day with FDR and Stalin. And also being an actress, she's very skilled in diplomacy and being able to act in certain situations where it is quite uncomfortable. So that's very helpful. Kathleen Harriman speaks Russian, so she is very useful to her father on just that very technical level to be able to communicate with everyone. She's also familiar with the most important people across all three delegations, as an American working for the Americans, having lived in London and having become very good friends with the Churchills and their inner circle, and then having spent the last 15 months in Moscow, where she has become the American woman who's had more access to Stalin and his inner circle than any other American woman in history.
Wow.
And Anna Roosevelt, professionally, she had been an editor. She and her husband ran a newspaper in Seattle called the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. So she does have this professional ability and often helps her father with important speeches, reads drafts of remarks he wants to give, helps craft the message after Yalta of what has taken place there to communicate to the American people. And so she's very useful in this regard, but she also, being this protector for her father, she's literally keeping her father alive. And while we may disagree with what she was doing and think, it's not appropriate, sometimes the interference she was running, if she hadn't, perhaps he would have died at Yalta and the history could have been completely different.
Yeah, so you describe her kind of looking in the diplomatic pouch or whatever the secret papers were, right? And sorting through what she could do herself, what she could, tell somebody else to do, kind of paring it down to the absolute essentials of what he needed to see and know, right?
Exactly. The doctors advised that he should be working no more than 4 hours a day. As the President of the United States, this is a tall order and really impossible order. And so she, before they go to Yalta, for that year that she was in the White House, she's really become his gatekeeper, and she is helping to determine who should have an audience with him, who can handle certain papers that are delivered to him. Everyone wants to meet with the president, not everyone needs to. And as much as he might like to meet with everyone, she knows that if he does this, then there'll be nothing left, and he very well could die.
Right. It's extraordinary. It's really amazing to think about. It was not just helping them, get bedding, right? It wasn't just helping them run errands. It was much more complicated.
Yes.
Than that. And when you understand that, for example, on the way, it was something like an 8-hour drive, right? Because they had to drive at 20 miles an hour, pockmarked roads, and Roosevelt couldn't stop for lunch. The Russians had arranged this elaborate lunch at a stopping point. Mm-hmm. And then so Churchill had just eaten, but he knew he couldn't turn down the lunch because, and then when FDR didn't go at the lunch, the foreign minister was crestfallen, and it would have been completely alarming, right? It was semi-alarming. This was now a crisis, right? That he didn't have lunch. So, I mean, it was just these kind of things, not to mention the larger events, for example, what was going on with Poland, and how borders were going to be drawn.
Exactly. I mean, the smallest details could have enormous ramifications for what's decided in the conference room later. If you, spell someone's name wrong on a place card and they're horribly offended, they'll carry that offense with them into the conference room and be a lot less willing to negotiate with you. And so it's just these moments where you think, oh, is that really important to world affairs? And yes, it is. I mean, otherwise, half of the State Department wouldn't exist. I mean, there's a whole Office of Protocol, which helps to make sure that these unseen elements that we don't even think about and we take for granted don't become a problem, because it's like a little, small irritation, a little pee under the mattress can cause somebody to have a terrible night's sleep, and then they're cranky the next day and you don't want to work with you. And so the goodwill that goes into something like this is only the result of the hard work of many people to oversee the smallest detail. And sometimes, Churchill had eaten lunch, desperately wants to get there. He's been driving for hours in the freezing cold in these uncomfortable cars past really horrible signs of destruction and devastation of the war. But if they both take off and ride off into the sunset, the Russians will feel very offended and slighted at their extreme attempts at generosity and hospitality, and even just procuring food and drink and glassware in this area that has been destroyed. It's just, they would feel so offended that they didn't acknowledge the attempts that they made to be generous hosts. So this is very important to them.
And just the incredible contrast between the countryside and what Stalin has done to some of his people, and the absolute over-the-top luxury of the banquets and everything that they're providing. You describe some of that as well.
Yes. Kathleen Harriman's letters are full of these examples of living in the Soviet Union, in this land of extremes, where on the one hand, she's being given these beautiful dahlias and irises and hothouse flowers for her table. But yet in the embassy, windows that had gotten bombed out in the Battle of Moscow haven't been replaced. And there's no glass in many rooms of this embassy. It's freezing in the middle of winter in Russia, and yet she has these gorgeous flowers, but no glass. And so it's, this constant struggle between extreme graciousness and elegance, but also privation and devastation. And the two are really inseparable in the Soviet Union at the time. And I think you continue for many years. And you think about the beauty and elegance of culture in Russia. You think about the ballet and the classical music and the art, but then you also think about the horrible living conditions and the tragedy and the suffering of starvation and famine, and the brutality of the years under communism. And it's very hard to reconcile them in your mind, but you can see the earlier examples of that during the war and even prior to the war, which someone who, like Kathy Harriman, has spent a lot of time as an observer can keenly see and record for posterity. So it's wonderful to read those examples in her letters.
Yeah, and that expands out into Yalta because of they know about kind of what Stalin did to the Poles, how they stood outside of Warsaw and watched them be just mowed down by the Nazis. And I'm not sure if they knew about some of the mass murders that were taking place in Russia at the same time, but it mattered to Averell Harriman, that they be kind of watched, right? That they not be trusted as much. But to FDR, he thought, I just want to resolve this in the best interest of the United States.
Exactly. I think FDR in some ways is kind of willing to miss the trees for the broader forest. One of his biggest goals is to establish a peace organization of the United Nations and to succeed where Woodrow Wilson failed after the First World War, and has this much larger objective of guaranteeing peace for at least 50 years in Europe, which is extremely important to everyone. And so the quarrels between nations to him are less important than this broader objective in the service of humanity. And in a sense, he's hoping that he will be able to overcome some of these, more local issues that have been an issue for centuries, with a much broader organization committed to advancing the interests of everyone.
And is there anything from this story that haunts you or has stayed with you?
Yes, absolutely. First, the position in which Anna Roosevelt finds herself is extremely heartbreaking at times, to be a daughter and knowing that your father is about to die and not to be able to tell anyone, and to be able to have to carry this burden. It would be a horrible position to be in, and then to have to try to make some of the decisions that he's placed on her somewhat unfairly as well. And my heart truly goes out to her. And also, the role of being that closest aid and that closest ally with your father for Kathleen Harriman is something that she desperately wanted, since they didn't have a close relationship when she was a young girl, but they really discovered during World War II. And the Harriman's relationship is really more like business partners or colleagues and father and daughter in some ways. And unfortunately for Kathy, the trade-off of this, the opportunity to be with her father and to be on the front lines of history is that she has to bear witness to some, true crimes against humanity during the war as her father's envoy, again, in this quasi-official position. This is prior to Yalta, where she is the American witness from the embassy to the Katyn Forest massacre, where thousands of Polish officers had been killed by the Soviets earlier in the war. And she has to be the witness to mass graves and evidence and try to make up her mind whether it was the Soviets or the Nazis who had killed these Poles, and report back to her father. And while all the while managing the delicate balance of the relationship with the Soviet allies.
It's so amazing to think about what history can turn on, from the most minute details, right, to some of the largest events that were overlooked. I mean, it's really kind of amazing to think about.
Absolutely.
And so what's new in this history? And why do you think it's remained hidden for so long? You mentioned the papers, so perhaps you've already answered this question.
Yes, the papers on the one hand, I was able to have access to Sarah's papers, Kathleen's papers, original interviews with Anna Roosevelt's children. I got to interview Winston Churchill's secretary, Lady Jane Williams, who is in her 90s, and she's also the mother of the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is another fun experience that she's had as a person on the forefront of history. And so to be able to gather new information about these women and this time from people who remember them, in that time is something that we may not have many opportunities to do in the future. So to be able to gather that for posterity now is very important. But I also think that moments like the Yalta Conference are placed on this very lofty pedestal. You think of, the summits, literally the word summit, these gatherings of world leaders in these crucial moments, really Yalta on the precipice between World War and Cold War. And I think for many people thinking about these moments in history that are populated by these great men of history in capital letters, it feels very unapproachable. And it feels like something that many people feel that they can't understand and is a bit intimidated. But I also wanted to show people that this, for being great men of history, these men, they're also people. And they have the same loves and fears and hopes and dreams as the rest of us. And to some people, they really are just dad. And so viewing the Yalta Conference through this different lens that's, cuts across generations and gender, it makes these lofty moments in history much more personal. And I hope it shows that people can understand these moments. And, even though it is, the Yalta Conference, it's also a collection of people who are hoping and dreaming for better times, just like the rest of us, and who are parents and children. And those are relationships that we can all understand, even if we don't know what it's like, and we'll never know what it's like to be staring down Stalin across a conference table.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think you make that clear. But I think it's also like a fresh, interesting take on history, So I'm sorry, somebody just had a question. Oh, how have the family members reacted? Is that Robin is asking, to the book?
Yes, so one of the greatest joys of working on this has been the chance to connect with the family members of these three women. I have been so fortunate to interview them. They very kindly gave me access to the entire collection of the personal papers of these women from this period, which was such a great treat. But it was just to be able to then show them the completed manuscript, and despite the access they gave me, they didn't constrain me in any way from saying what they, from what I, as a historian, my job is to be objective and impartial. And so at the end of the day, what I wanted to make sure was that, even if they weren't happy with every moment in history, because we all have aspects of our past that perhaps are less flattering or things that we would have done differently, but to represent the people as truly as I could so that they were as they remembered them. And one of the most meaningful experiences of doing this was hearing from the families afterwards. And for example, Kathleen Harriman only died 9 years ago. And so she really didn't share these wartime experiences with her children. And so then to hear from her sons after they read the manuscript that they realized new aspects of their mother's life, and there are questions that they wish they'd asked that they had never known that they should ask because she didn't share this moment. It brought their mother back in a different way, and knowing her as a young woman, which is an opportunity that none of us, very few of us have, to know our parents at that stage of life. And so that, you know, when I heard that from them, it really truly brought tears to my eyes. And I felt like more than anything, if I had accomplished that, then I had achieved something that I set out to do.
Of course, yeah. So it wasn't just her papers, because, you know, they must have read through her papers. It must have been other sources that gave them that picture, right?
They had read through some of her papers, but they hadn't read through all of them. And I think it's also very, you know, personal to read through your parents' papers, and sometimes, you know, it's hard to, you know, especially, you know, if you miss someone, it's wonderful to be able to go back and read their papers and hear their voice. But while the, you know, the pain of losing someone is still very present, for, you know, it can also be very difficult. And sometimes, you know, having it delivered in a different way, you're not, you know, reading the letters in her hand, which can be very emotional. So it was a wonderful opportunity for me, you know, as a historian, to hear from these families that these individuals really were represented in the book the way that they remembered them, and it felt like it, you know, brought them back to life in a sense, and I couldn't possibly ask for more.
Yeah, well, what a great gift you gave them. That's so nice to hear. So let me say, so Jeremy is asking if you have any favorite books or authors that help shape your writing.
Oh my gosh, that is, for me, asking me to pick a favorite book is like asking someone to pick a favorite child.
Influence your writing, that have influenced your writing. I mean, you speak with great admiration of Erik Larson's, of the Splendid.
Yes. Absolutely. I love, some of my favorite nonfiction authors are Erik Larson. I love The Splendid and the Vile. I also love his book Dead Wake. I love Daniel James Brown's The Boys in the Boat. It's a phenomenal story. I think a lot of people who've read Erik Larson have also read that. I also have great admiration for some of my advisors and professors. There's a wonderful book by David Reynolds, who was my advisor at Cambridge, which is called In Command of History, Churchill Fighting and Writing the Second World War, which is a history of Churchill writing his wartime memoirs, which is fascinating. We don't think about, you know, the craft of writing history and how this all comes together. Yeah. And so to understand how he was able to reconstruct those times immediately after the war was fascinating, and also just kind of personally very interesting to me, because his publisher for that book was my publisher. So it's also kind of a history of the publishing house of Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, which was really quite interesting.
Oh, I had no idea that Houghton Mifflin was his publisher.
Yeah, he was the original, they were the original publisher, and surprisingly, his wartime memoirs came out in America before they came out in Britain. So they were the first publisher of Churchill's wartime memoirs.
Oh, I wanted to show you something. So my grandfather was English, and he worked at the British Embassy during the war in Washington.
Wow.
From 49 to 44. Yeah. So I have a couple of great things, but one of them is a postcard of Winston Churchill. So I'll hold it up, but it's really, let me make sure. Oh, you can't see it because of the screen share.
I can see it.
You can? Can you see
yes,
it?
Yes.
So you
wow.
See, so and it's Winston Churchill wearing his steel helmet and the smile of confidence.
I love that. Oh, that's
so great. I'll put it on Instagram because the virtual background is.
Yes, please do. I'd love to get a closer look at that.
And the other thing is, it was my mother was the same age as Diana Hopkins.
Really?
She played with her.
Oh my gosh! Wow.
It's actually a lot of mischief. And so one story that I've heard is they were playing in the White House, and I was trying to decide I was trying to tell. I think they were both 11 at the time, so I don't know if it was before her mother died or after. But my mother ran into the switchboard room during these times of very delicate negotiations and yanked out all of the wires.
Oh my gosh.
Just kind of playing Eloise in the White House.
Oh my gosh, that's fantastic.
And then she also prank called an ambulance on one of the neighbors down the street from Harry Hopkins' house.
Oh my gosh.
That got her in more trouble than he was unconnecting the switchboard.
Wow. Oh my goodness.
And then I met Diana Hopkins when she was older. So it's just, it's amazing to hear. And now I understand that since Harry Hopkins lived in the White House, that's how that thing happens.
Yes, yeah, he lived there until he remarried to Louise Macy, and then they moved to a house on N Street in Georgetown. But yeah, Diana Hopkins very much grew up in the White House after her mother died, and Eleanor Roosevelt was kind of a surrogate mother and guardian to her for the period that she lived there. And there's a very touching note that Harry Hopkins leaves for his daughter, because he is also extremely sick, like FDR at this time. He's been, struggling with stomach cancer for years. people gave him months to live, and he lived for, more than half a decade after that, just powered by this just need to keep going.
Yeah.
And so he realizes he also, it's possible that he doesn't come back from Yalta. And so he does leave his daughter a note, saying, he's leaving what little he has to her, and that Mrs. Roosevelt will see that she has a good education and will look after her. And so it's, for all these people, this moment is extremely personal, and it's also very heartbreaking. And it's not without danger. Getting to Yalta is at times, perilous, and one British plane did go down on the way there. And so nothing in war is to be taken for granted. Nothing is to be taken lightly.
Yeah,
and
British plane went down, and then the ports were filled with mines. I mean, they had to navigate a lot just to get there. Yeah,
exactly, just to get there. And so I had the chance to speak with Diana Hopkins' niece towards the end of writing this.
Oh, wow. And she has a son too, right? She has a son, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And so it's really exciting to connect with these families, and to hear stories like yours. It makes you realize that these moments in history aren't so long ago, and that they really are people and their family, and your family and my family and their families. And I think that's something that we can all relate to.
Yeah. I'm going to ask some of these other questions, but I want to ask you, so my mother also mentioned having lunch with Eleanor Roosevelt, and that she put ketchup on everything. Have you ever
I'm sorry?
That she put ketchup on everything. Have you ever heard that?
I haven't heard that directly. I know that the White House was not known at that time for having phenomenal food. I think there was guests would come and say it's somewhat like a nursery meal. But FDR liked what he liked, and Eleanor did too. But I do know about the picnic that Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt hosted when the King and Queen came to visit, and it was the first time they had hot dogs, and so they very much were they had simple tastes in that respect, very much like everyone else. And I think that was something when the King and Queen came to visit that they enjoyed and found very charming.
Oh, really? They enjoyed it. Oh, I'm surprised. Oh, okay. So let's see. Eric's sorry, let me just catch up on these comments. Okay, so Lindsay is asking, what is it that gave each of these women the courage to meet these challenges? Great question, Lindsay.
Yes, I think for each of them, it was experiences that they had had earlier in life. I think for Sarah Churchill, it was this lifelong desire to be the person of importance in these moments to her father, and the sense that she had had since a little girl, that she understood him in a way that others didn't. And so even though she was very shy as a young girl, and she was too nervous to speak to him sometimes, she'd write him notes instead of approaching him directly. It was the sense that she understood the workings of his brain, and that they had a connection that he didn't share with anyone else. And I think that those childhood memories for her were really what gave her the confidence throughout these years.
Yeah, and I love what he said about her, about her shyness. He said, Sarah is an oyster. She will never reveal her secrets.
Exactly. And so if there's anyone you want at your side in a moment like this, it's someone like Sarah. Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, for the other daughters, I think Kathleen Harriman was just an incredibly adventurous and bold young woman. She was one who, her sister was married with a baby. She's like, that's fine, I will do that later, but I want to go see something in the world, and I want to have this great adventure. And she and her father were very similar in that regard. And she had begun this journey of working with him almost as a colleague while she was in college. She would go out to Sun Valley, his ski resort in Idaho, and she would help him. She would look after important guests like Ernest Hemingway. She would do a bit of recon on neighboring ski resorts that were popping up. So they had worked together in kind of this, this almost like a trial run before she goes and moves to London with him during the Blitz. And he feels it's very important for her to have this experience. It's a once in a lifetime opportunity. And, despite the danger, he is forward thinking. And his sister was also very important to the FDR New Deal administration. She and Frances Perkins were the two top ranking women there. And so having seen his sister perform in this role, he realized what an opportunity it would be for his daughter at a time when many men didn't think of their daughters in that respect. So, very forward thinking of him. And for Anna, I think it's just this constant desire to, recapture what she remembered as a child before her father's illness. They were very close at the, when she was a little girl. They would ride their horses together and spend long periods of time in nature. They were both very interested in the natural world. And so she wanted to recapture that, and she knows this is her last chance. And so it's this, this desperation in these last days that, despite whatever trepidation she has, she knows that this is it, which is just heartbreaking.
Yeah, you just made a great point about that. It's very, it's not really forward thinking, but it's an advanced frame of mind to think about your daughters to have, you know, such capacities and to give them so much responsibility.
Yes.
I mean, we have opinions about nepotism in politics now and during JFK, like that's like a separate question, but just in terms of like the responsibilities that, you know, how they could have viewed their daughters and how they did.
Yes.
So.
I mean, it does open a discussion about how involved should the unelected family members of an elected official be in their public duties. Right. On the one hand, you want a family to be there, to be the, you know, that voice of conscience, to be the trusted audience who you can talk to at 2 o'clock in the morning as a crisis is occurring to figure out what to do. But on the other hand, it's a, you know, a slippery slope of just, you know, being related to a president isn't necessarily the, you know, a sufficient credential to have certain positions. Nepotism is in every line of work, every industry, and not just politics. But I do think, you know, questions about the role of the family in politics is one that's perhaps more important now than ever before, especially in this election cycle. The role of the first spouse is fairly well defined, but adult first children, we haven't really had to think about their role too much in recent years, because most of the, you know, more recent presidents have had young children during their time in the White House. And so it's an important conversation that we should have. And I hope that the book can shed some light on this and help advance that conversation as well.
And Pam is asking, how much knowledge do you think the US or Kathleen had about Stalin's programs like those in Lithuania that Ruta Sepetys wrote about in her book, Between Shades of Grey?
Yeah, I think that Americans had underestimated and had a real lack of understanding about the Soviet Union in the years prior to and during World War II. Diplomatic relations had been cut off between the two countries after the Russian Revolution in 1917, and it's only when FDR restores them that they're able to have, you know, a dialogue again. But people, you know, in America were not learning Russian at the time. It wasn't really an option to study Russian in school. There is one Russian-English grammar book at the time, and it's really, you know, only once Kathleen is in London and she is covering conferences as a journalist between the exiled leaders from Eastern Europe, like, you know, the Polish prime minister, and she starts hearing these warnings that yes, the Nazis of course are the enemy, but Stalin is not all that he seems. It begins a recalibration in her mind about what she knows about the Soviet Union, and a real awareness of the lack of understandings that Americans have at the time. And I think to some extent we still have today. In Russian is, you know, you think about, oh, Russia, the Cold War is over, but it's often when you think certain themes and periods of history are over that they come back again in a different way, and you find yourself kind of unprepared or caught on the back foot, because it does require some imagination to think about, you know, issues that we think are in the past in the context of the modern world. And so I think that those experiences of someone like Kathy Harriman are very important to keep in mind, especially today as the world changes and certain themes and tensions and relationships come back to the fore again.
Yeah, it makes it even more extraordinary that she learned Russian when there were basically not even any books, right?
Exactly. I mean, she gets over there, she is told she needs to get Bondar's simplified Russian method. She has no idea what a Bondar is. She learns the Russian alphabet on the plane on the way to Moscow. People are trying to learn the Russian alphabet is extremely difficult, and then try to do it in an unpressurized, freezing plane, bouncing around in very, you know, uncomfortable conditions, not like the kind of air travel we have today. And then once she gets there, there are no English-speaking Russian tutors available. They're all booked, and so she has to find one who speaks French. And Kathy speaks French, so kind of triangulate among the 3 languages. It's just really remarkable what she was able to accomplish.
Yeah. I'll just read what Sue's saying, because I'm sure you may understand. It was interesting to learn that many of the Russians, so it sounds like she read the book, to learn that many of the Russian POWs didn't want to be repatriated due to the fear of reprisals for just being caught.
Yes. In the Soviet Union, it was viewed as a sign of weakness and shame to have been captured as a POW. Stalin's own son was captured, and he's given the opportunity to exchange him, and he decides not to do it. His son's wife is also arrested because, you know, this, you know, idea of being a POW, it's like you gave up to your enemy, and therefore your whole family is the enemy. And the threat of reprisals and death was very real. And tragically, many POWs who were being repatriated to the Soviet Union also tried to commit suicide rather than be returned to the Soviet Union. And it's horrific, and it's definitely one of the stains on those late days of the war and the first days of the peace that we in the West weren't able to do something more for them.
This explains some things that I've seen as well. So basically, they didn't trust that they didn't give up information, that they weren't.
That, and also just, it's a sign of shame. I think the Russians are operating under the everyone's expendable, let's just throw more people at it. They don't want to have mass desertions. It's just not an option. So they don't want to give people the chance to see, oh, you can surrender and you can live and, maybe live somewhere else. That's just not part of the mentality, and it's tragically not acceptable. And the ramifications, not just to you as an individual, but your whole family, were horrific.
We're going a little bit over, maybe 5 minutes, and at the end of it, we are going to give away 3 copies of the book. So just for you that are still here. I just want to, so tell us the significance of that region and the timeliness of it.
Yes, I mean, the Crimea has been at the crossroads of empire, of clashing nations for centuries, going back to the Crimean War. The Church of the Light Brigade is taking place right there. And so you have a part of the world that is, every time it builds itself back up again and rebuilds neighborhoods, homes, families trying to pull together again, just a generation later, it's all once again destroyed. You have the Nazis coming through, and then the Soviets had already decimated this area with the government sponsored famines essentially in the 1930s. But it's also an area that continues to be a flashpoint today. You had the 2014 annexation of Crimea by Russia. You had the Kerch Strait incidents last year. And so this area in the world, it's cursed by its geography. And I think that this will continue to be a flashpoint for many years to come, despite the fact you think of it as this beautiful region. It's a place where many Russians like to go on vacation. And so it's kind of, again, the duality of the brutality and the glamour in the Soviet Union and in Russia, which the daughters have experienced, which you can still see in many examples today.
And what relevance does Yalta have today?
Oh gosh, so much. Again, not only just the current sparring in the region there, and as I mentioned, the questions of the unelected family members, but also you think about how to deal with Russia trying to bring them into the international community and work with them, but also to recognize that what they say and their commitments are not necessarily in line with the West in many cases. I think since Yalta and since FDR, his attempts to form his personal relationship with Stalin, he really believed that Stalin liked him, and if he could form this personal relationship, there would be a breakthrough in international relations. Unfortunately, that did not prove to be the case. Stalin very well may have liked him, but his personal, admiration for FDR, which I do think was quite real, was not going to get in the way of putting the interests of his nation first.
That's just not the Russian mentality, right? To have that personal relationships with,
Exactly. And you've seen subsequent American presidents, as recently as President Bush, President Obama, President Trump, albeit President Trump in a slightly different way, trying to form this personal relationship. And for 75 years, that has not been a strategy that has worked. And so you look back at Yalta and see some of the communications of people like George Tenon or Chip Bolin, who became wise men of the Cold War, and see their kind of side discussions about how to treat the Soviet Union, how to deal with the Soviet leader. And I think those are very legitimate conversations that we should still be having today, and perhaps see Yalta as a moment where we began a strategy, and maybe now is the time to depart from that strategy in hopes of moving forward in a more constructive way in the relationships between Russia and the West.
And several people are asking about the relationship between the daughters. Did they get along, or?
I think we like to think of them, these daughters, kind of their 3 girls against the world. They were certainly friends. They got along well. Sarah and Kathleen were good friends in London prior to Yalta. Anna Roosevelt had never met the other 2 before Yalta. But it's also, you have to keep in mind that they're there as their father's envoys, their father's representatives. And so the relationships among the daughters ebb and flow with the relationships among the fathers. And so you can see that mirrored across the generations. And while they got along very well and had a fantastic experience together and really, some unique shared memories that they would take forward forever, it's not like they're three chums on a holiday abroad. They really were there acting in the interests of their father and their nations first.
The orientation was to their fathers, right? It wasn't to,
Always.
or to each other. And
Exactly.
so, and what's next for you?
Yes. Well, I am, I suppose, one of these lucky people who is fascinated by so many things. I love to learn. I think it's probably one of the reasons I decided to put myself to the torture of finishing a book and doing the first year of law school at the same time.
Right.
Unique torture I wouldn't wish on anyone, but I live to tell the tale. I definitely plan to finish law school, but I also want to continue writing and to continue with history, which has always been my first love. And I have an idea of what I want to work on next. One of the paradoxes of COVID is that we have more time than we had before, a lot of time for thinking and writing, but as a historian, I can't get to the archives I need to see the documents, the primary sources, to do the research. And so once it is possible to travel again and get to these archives, I hope to make a lot of headway on what I want to work on next. And I hope that throughout my career, I'm able to bridge my interest in history and the law and use the two fields to help people understand the complex issues that face us today and how history can inform a way that we can move forward better together.
So do you want to give a hint about what period, or you want to keep it under your head?
What I anticipate working on next is hoping to stay in this time period as well. My background is in 19th and 20th century British, European, and American history. And so I've always been really fascinated by that. But that also means that it's possible to fly to different parts of the world in your imagination within this time period and see different perspectives on people and their times in ways that, with the openings of archives and collections that weren't available before, and the technology and resources to be able to mine these archives in a way that it wasn't possible if you had to physically go to all these locations. I think it's a really exciting time to be a historian and to bring stories that have been long hidden to the forefront of people's minds. And that's what I hope I achieved with this book, and it's what I hope to do again. I loved every minute of working on it, and there's nothing I would love more than to have that feeling over and over again and to bring great stories to the world.
Yes, definitely. Well, I certainly hope that you continue to do it. Did you have a favorite library or archive?
Ooh, this is so hard. There's so many great ones. Well, I was able to work with some really fantastic people at kind of the core archives for this project. The Churchill Archive Center in Cambridge in England, the National Archives and the FDR Library in Hyde Park, New York, the Library of Congress. All of these archives have just wonderful people. And also Georgetown. There was an archive at Clemson, which I wasn't able to get to in person, but they were able to send me some material about Jimmy Burns, another one of the delegates at the conference. And so you have, these massive archives, but also some smaller ones that are out of the way. And one of the exciting things to do is to find some archives that are a bit off the beaten trail
Yes.
and see what exists, because you don't know until you get there, and it's a little bit of a treasure hunt.
Wow. And did you have any insights about Stalin and his daughter?
Yes, so the relationship between Stalin and Svetlana is very different than these other fathers and daughters. At the time of Yalta, Svetlana is 19. She is married and pregnant with her first child, and she and her father have had a very tumultuous relationship for many years, since she discovered that her mother had committed suicide, which is something that she didn't know until she was a teenager.
Oh my God.
And Svetlana does speak English, and so she could have been a real asset to her father in this environment, but he doesn't like for her to interact with foreigners. And Winston Churchill did have a brief glimpse into the home life of Stalin on a visit to Moscow during the war when he did meet Svetlana, and she reminded him a bit of Sarah. She's also a redhead, had a fiery personality. But Svetlana and her father at this time are on very bad terms. He has sent her lover to the Siberia. She then gets married, makes a rebellious marriage at just 19 years old to one of her classmates, Grigory Morozov, who's Jewish. Stalin takes issue with it, refuses to meet Svetlana's husband. So it is definitely not a warm and fuzzy time in the relationship between the two of them. And Svetlana does later defect from the Soviet Union and moves to the United States.
Wow. All right. Well, I think this has been really incredible. And thank you so much for this book and for joining us tonight, because I think it was really great. And I want to recommend Catherine's website to everyone, because she has really great cards, as I was showing you, with bios of each person in the book. So it's really wonderful to see them. I know you guys really love that, and I do as well as some Q&A. And you had mentioned, are you willing to do Zooms with book clubs, or what is your feeling about that?
Yes, absolutely. If you have a book club, I'd love to talk to you. It's a lot of fun. One of the great things about having the technology to do that is I can connect with people around, and not being able to do a book tour in the way that we had at first envisioned is a bit sad. So I'd really love to connect with readers and to hear what's resonating with them. So if you do have a book club, I'd certainly love to join you if I can.
Great. That's great news. So, and through your contact link on your website, right? Here, let me give your website right now. So people
my website is my name, CatherineGraceKatz.com.
Yeah, I got it. Okay. Did it come through? Yes, it did. All right, I'll just do it again. All right. Thank you so much. I want to, and the best of luck. You are a rising star, I really feel.
Thank you.
So we are very lucky to catch you on your ascendancy.
I really appreciate that. I mean, a writer is nothing without readers. So thank you to everyone for your interest in this story. I hope that these young women move you and you touch your heart in the way that they truly have for mine. The curse of the historian is that you can never meet these people who you spend so much time getting to know, down to the smallest detail. But I hope that if nothing else, people can discover this story about three remarkable women in a remarkable time. And so thank you to all of you for joining today, and thank you so much for reading the book.
Thank you. All right, so I'm gonna we're just gonna say goodbye to you, and then I'm gonna pick winners. So, but you don't need to be here for this. All right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good evening.
Thank you. You too. Okay. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, I will pick 3 winners. Oh, it's only giving me on-camera participants. Just so you know. Oh, show non-video participants. All right. How about that? I'll pick a non-video participant and then a video participant, because it's always brave to be on camera. Anne Hayek? Okay. You hear me, right? Okay. Anne, you're one.
Hey, thank you.
There you go. Okay, so if you can chat me your your mailing address so we know where to mail the book.
Okay.
Okay, or you can mail it to me at info@bookmovement.com. Whichever.
I didn't get all that.
Oh, do you know how to chat me on Zoom?
Nope.
Okay.
I'm 81. I'm barely hanging in.
It's just info@bookmovement.com.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right, great. And let's see, Amy Epstein. Amy, if you're listening, you are another winner.
Yes, thank you.
All right, great. And let us see. And Catherine Begg, if you're still listening, you are the 3rd winner.
Yay.
So email me your mailing address, and we'll send you a copy of the book. And thank you, everyone. This is a giant audience. But I really think that, it's such an interesting to see the contrast between the Blitz and then what happened in the intervening 5 years. It's kind of like so sad.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting to read about. And I think she's really has such an interesting background. So it's kind of, this is her first book, and she's so young. So it's interesting to catch her at the infancy of her career. So thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.